My name's Rab Bennetts. I'm an architect and my company is Bennetts Associates, and it's a company I founded 21 years ago. We're about 65 strong, so it's a reasonable size, and we do buildings of all kinds. Now, I've always been interested in environmental issues, even since I was a student, and I was able to work on environmentally interesting buildings from the moment I left university, when I went to work for Arabs for 10 years. And I quickly learnt that the buildings that seemed to have a much better impact on the, much lower impact on the environment were in fact nicer buildings. They were not only nicer to be in, more interesting for the people who use them and all the rest of it, but they actually made better architecture, which I thought was incredibly important, and there seemed to be a kind of virtuous circle of these things coming together. So I've always pushed it because I've always been interested in environmental issues, but I've always also made sure that it's good architecture at the same time, because it seems to me that if the buildings aren't nice buildings, people won't want to do it. So what we have done over the years, ever since I formed the company, is that we've tried to do environmentally sensitive buildings, and we've also tried to get awards for architecture at the same time to prove that it is possible to do both of those things in one go. And if we have a criticism of the environmental movement, I suppose, historically, it's that so many of the early environmentally friendly buildings were actually rather boring. We tended to ridicule them a little bit, say they were nuts and berries buildings and so on, because actually that's rather trivial stuff, but I'm sure you see the point. What we're trying to get across is that you can do substantial, big, everyday buildings like offices or housing estates or theatres or whatever it happen to be, but those everyday buildings can also be much better for the environment than has previously been the case. But the strand that we've tried to follow, certainly most recently as we've understood more about it, is to try and measure the impacts. Instead of just having a kind of vague and perhaps rather woolly aspiration for sustainability, we found it's best to try to focus on things that you can actually measure, and then you can demonstrate exactly what you're doing and see if you are actually having an effect or not. And the reason for doing that is twofold. Firstly, to try and make sure the science is rigorous and make sure we're genuinely learning from what we do, and that we can plough that into the next project and the one after that and always improve. But there's another subplot to this, is that I think an awful lot of designers of buildings frankly spin it out a bit too much. They say they've got a green building, but where's the proof? You know, we have lots of examples out there of buildings that have been tagged green, but actually are they really green? And you only have to look at some of them to begin to doubt if that's the case. So glassy buildings particularly, especially the ones that face the sun, without any kind of shading or whatever, they're bound to need some form of artificial cooling to keep them habitable, or the people inside are going to get uncomfortable. So we don't want to do that. We want to put the pressure on to measure the buildings, make sure it's factual, instead of uncover the greenwash, if you like, and try to get to the bottom of whether these projects really are green or not. So that's one strand of what we do, trying to marry up the science with the art, which I think is terribly important. There's another aspect to it which I think is personally very, very interesting, and I think it could apply to all cultures in all parts of the world and so on. It's that, again, I discovered this from a very early age, that the better responses are the local ones. And if you go to India or the Far East or Saudi Arabia or North America or Northern Europe, and so all the responses to the best stuff, of course, is very much tuned to the climates that they're in. That's fairly obvious, but also the people have a role in this too. So if you're trying to do something like reduce the carbon emissions of a building, you find you have to work with the local climate. And that's great, because it means, for example, in the desert, if there was such a project, it would be a very heavy, massive building which tries to keep temperatures stable, so that at night when it gets really cold in the desert, it retains the warmth from during the day. And during the day, when it's really hot in the desert, of course, you keep temperatures stable from having got a bit cooler during the night. And so it's a much more even kind of environment internally. Now that's a historic example, and if you look at the ancient buildings in the desert, that's exactly what they're like. They're heavy buildings. If you go to the Far East, which is different, it's hot at night as well as during the day, it's very moist and humid, so you often find spindly, lightweight buildings with open sides with the breeze going through, and that's the sensation of keeping cool for those people. So you find these two extremes in those examples of architecture which changes throughout the world. It's not anti-modern, you can still do modern design, but you have to make it different. And again, if I've got one criticism and complaint about my own profession, is that the best or most famous architects seem to be producing the same kind of building all around the world. It's the glassy tower block in Shanghai, and it's the same glassy tower block in Frankfurt. I mean, what's that all about? That's completely crazy. Actually, it should be a completely different building from one side of the world to another. And we've even discovered within Britain, the building at the north of Britain is very slightly and subtly different from the building at the south of Britain because of the climate. And if then you start adding in local cultural conditions like who makes it, where are the materials coming from, can you measure the transport emissions to make sure it's local materials and so on, you start getting a sensibility and a flavour for local things which means we're overcoming some of the kind of globalization of design, which is applied to all things these days, whether it's hamburgers or concrete or whatever it happens to be. Globalization seems to be running completely counter to those things which have the smallest impacts on the planet. So thinking local terms, we find buildings with local appearance, local aesthetics, local materials, slightly better attuned to the local cultures, but it's still modern design. There's no compromise to the architecture. They're still good buildings, and that's what I'm interested in.